Hi everyone, and welcome to Exploring the Build. If you just found this place, then welcome. And if you're returning, I'm glad to have you back. I'm Alex, and this is my channel where we theorycraft and explore different character builds for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Today, we're doing another Gloomhaven character build where we're trying to take the character classes from the hit board game Gloomhaven and recreate them into Dungeons & Dragons. Today's also another one of our locked character classes, where we are trying to make the Triangles class, or Triforce class as it's sometimes called, from Gloomhaven. As usual, this is our spoiler warning. If you don't want any spoilers for this class in particular, then feel free to come back and watch the video at a later time. I won't take any offense. If you're okay with the spoilers or already know what the class is, then feel free to come along for the journey as we explore the build. I'll pause now for the last spoiler warning, but then we'll be jumping right into the build. Okay, with that out of the way, let's get started. Today we are looking at making the Triangles class, also known as the Elementalist. The Elementalist is the rough equivalent of another caster sort of class in Gloomhaven. They are primarily a ranged damage dealer with the capability of dealing a fair amount of AoE damage or adding specific bonuses to their attacks. They're also capable of generating each and every element found in Gloomhaven, that is, fire, ice, earth, air, light, and darkness, and they're capable of using each of those elements to very devastating effects. Our Spellweaver was also capable of generating all the elements technically, but the Elementalist is actually capable of using them very consistently. Their entire gimmick is basically that they have a lot of really weak attacks, and usually single target attacks, but they can augment those attacks with any element or sometimes specific elements. Based on the elements that they actually use to augment their attacks, those attacks could then target multiple enemies. They could add some sort of debuff or negative condition to the enemy. They could just increase the damage. They are basically a formless character with a skeleton that we can then build as we want, depending on what sort of elements we want. When we're looking at making an Elementalist in D&D, we have a bit of a dilemma. See, D&D 5e is actually really bad at capturing the idea of an Elementalist who can use all the elements equally and has incentive to use all the elements equally. Usually, most of the features that buff elemental damage in D&D are better utilized when you just specialize into that type of damage. For example, the Elemental Adept feat, which will come up in our build eventually, technically can be taken more than once, and you can use it to buff multiple types of damage. But really, it's best used when you just take one type of damage and then just specialize into getting as much of that damage type as possible. Similarly, anytime we have a choice between dealing two types of damage to an enemy, even if we might be specialized into one or the other, the real question is, well, which one is the monster actually resistant to? If we can switch around the damage types, it's usually going to be better to switch to a damage type that they're not resistant to, rather than one that we just have some buffs for. For our build today, though, this just means that we're going to be looking at ways to actually get an incentive to use all the damage types, or as many damage types as possible, equally. We're not going to want to specialize into one specific element, because that's not what the Elementalist does. We're going to want to try and get all the elements from Gloomhaven, fire, ice, earth, air, light, and darkness, and try to find an incentive for each one to be able to feel like we're actually switching between these elements and using them rather effectively. We aren't going to be as mechanically powerful, yes, but we are certainly going to be very thematic. Before we start the build, though, let's look at their flavor text. The Savas Elementalist. Particularly skilled Savas may even gain mastery of more than one element and display up to 4 separate power cores in their chest. Such elementalists are respected above all others, and many of them hold the highest positions in Savas society. Still, other elementalists, however, feel that their own society has nothing left to teach them, and they leave to travel the world, constantly in search of some grander purpose. Starting at character creation with our lineage now, we are another Savas, which is the same as our Cragheart, which is also why we only read half the flavor text. This means that once again, we're going to have to take custom lineage. As usual, I'm going to take Dark Vision since there isn't any restriction on it from us, and we don't really need the other skill. Plus, it feels kind of appropriate that the rock type species from Gloomhaven would have some level of dark or low light vision. And then for our free feat, I'm going to say that we're taking Fey Touched. Fey Touched is a half feat, so we can boost our intelligence, wisdom, or charisma from it. Plus, it gives us some extra spell casting. We can cast Misty Step once per long rest without actually expending a spell slot. And then we get to choose another first level spell that is either enchantment or divination to cast the same way, just once per long rest for free. Misty Step is a mini teleport ability, but for our purposes, we're going to call it a jump ability from Gloomhaven, just because the Elementalist doesn't actually have any teleports, but we still want Fey Touched anyways. With the first level enchantment or divination spell, we're actually going to take Hex here. The reason we take Hex is because it's going to come in handy with a bit of our build a little later on. For our stats, we are just going to put everything into intelligence, and we're going to want to have the following ability scores: 8 strength, 14 dexterity, 12 constitution, 18 intelligence, 8 wisdom, and 14 charisma. And for our background, we can take anything as usual, but we want to stick to the theme of someone who has spent a portion of their life dedicated to the study and mastery of elemental magics. For us, I'm going to say Sage gives us that background, but feel free to pick your favorite. Okay, for the build, we're going to start off as a wizard. We're just going to take our full 20 levels in wizard, and we're going to pick scribe wizard so we can mix and match elements as much as we want to. Then we're going to use our ASI/feats to cap our intelligence at 20 right off the bat at level 4, and the rest of them are just going to be spent on taking Elemental Adept over and over again. We're going to pick fire to mimic the fire element from Gloomhaven, cold damage to mimic the ice element, and then either lightning or thunder for air, and either acid or poison for earth. Other than that, that's the build. Thanks for watching. Okay, so admittedly, that was a bit of a meme. In all seriousness, that build actually does kind of work, but it's a little boring and a little redundant as well. So we're going to actually build something that's a bit more interesting. However, if all you wanted was just a caster who is good with multiple elements, then technically a scribe wizard with a bunch of the elemental adept feats would work just fine, because anytime you needed to switch an element, you could switch to one that you still have a little bit of a buff for. However, for us, we're going to want to pick something that gives us a bit more than just the elemental adept incentive for our elements. We will still come back to it because it is a good feat when you're looking at making an elemental based character, but there are a few other things we want first. So here's what we're really going to want to do. At level 1, we're actually going to start Sorcerer. Our Cragheart was a stone sorcerer with an innate connection to earth magic, so it seems thematically fitting that we still have that similar connection. For us though, we're going to use another old Unearthed Arcana, and we're actually going to go with the Sea Sorcerer. Technically, yeah, we should probably still be the stone sorcerer because we also have a mastery of earth and we're the same species, but Sea Sorcerer is going to help us a little bit better in the long run. Also, if you don't want to use it or aren't allowed to use an Unearthed Arcana at your table, then the Storm Sorcerer, that is actually official material, would work as a fine replacement. It's just that the Sea Sorcerer has a couple more interesting mechanical benefits that are going to help us later on. The Sea Sorcerer is going to offer us the main mechanic right at level 1 that we're going to want to play around. Technically, we get 2 features, Soul of the Sea and Curse of the Sea, but Soul of the Sea just gives us a swim speed and the ability to breathe underwater. That's cool, but we don't really need it. Curse of the Sea, on the other hand, is an interesting feature. Whenever we damage an enemy with a cantrip, doesn't matter what kind of cantrip, we can curse them. It only targets one enemy at a time, unfortunately, so we can't curse a bunch, but to be fair, the Elementalist actually is a little bit more single target oriented than AoE oriented. They just have the capability to do AoE. So, the next time we cast a spell on that creature after we have cursed them with the cantrip, that spell gets an extra effect if it meets a certain couple of conditions. If the spell deals lightning or cold damage, then it's either going to deal extra damage to that target if it's lightning, or reduce their movement speed if it's cold. Additionally, if the spell actually forces an enemy to move, like Thunder Wave can push an enemy away, that forced movement gets increased by 15 feet, just flat out. This is going to be how we incentivize our different element uses. Right away, we know that if we're using cold damage, we can actually freeze at least one enemy in their tracks, more or less. And if we're using lightning damage, we can deal a little bit more damage to that enemy. So there's actually an incentive to use cold or lightning damage. Forced movement, I'm going to count as earth for us. And even though it's not anything that revolves around a specific damage type, anytime we do a spell that is going to be forced movement, we're going to try to find a way to make that an earth-flavored spell. That way, if we need to actually control enemies and push them around or even pull them around the battlefield, we can say that we're using our earth to do that. Right away, we get 3 of our 6, though really we're only ever going to have 4 primary elements that are incentivized to be used. But that's still really awesome for just level 1. For the actual spells we get as a sorcerer, take any that you like, same with the cantrips. Our charisma is pretty bad, and we aren't planning on sticking in sorcerer very long, so don't worry about picking up the most powerful spells that you possibly can. At level 2, we are immediately hopping over to Wizard. We wanted Sea Sorcery for that Curse of the Sea feature, but because we can activate the curse with any cantrip and then trigger it with any spell, Wizard is going to be our primary spellcasting class. At Wizard 1, we're just going to gain a spell book with 6 wizard spells, plus some cantrips, plus Arcane Recovery as well. Now for the spells and cantrips, pick your favorites. Just make sure you get a variety of damage-oriented spells, so stuff that uses attacks, stuff that uses saves, different damage types as well, anything like that. At level 3, we are a Wizard 2, and here we gain our Wizard subclass. For us, that is Scribe Wizard, like I had said in the meme, but we're actually going to really want it because it gains us a key feature. It actually gains us a lot of features, but the main one that is really key that I'm going to touch on is the Awakened Spellbook ability to change damage types almost at will. There are some restrictions, but let me make it easy. When we cast a spell from our spellbook, we can substitute the damage of that spell for another damage type that appears in another spell in our spellbook, but this spell has to be the same level as the one we're casting. That is what is going to make us an Elementalist. The fact that we can just change damage types at will in order to better trigger our Curse of the Sea effects. Right away at level 3, this is pretty much when the build just comes to fruition. Essentially, what we could do is turn 1, we use the Hex free casting that we got from Fey Touched as a bonus action on a target that we want to use our Curse of the Sea on. Then we hit that target with a cantrip that is an attack, so not only does it curse the enemy if we hit them, but it also deals an extra d6 damage from the Hex spell. Once we have that enemy cursed, we can then blast them next turn with any spell we want as long as we change it to deal either cold damage, lightning damage, or if it causes the enemy to move, then we could use any damage type we want. And even though technically the curse is only a single target feature, that doesn't stop us from using a big AoE effect like Burning Hands. It just means that when we turn the Burning Hands into cold damage, everyone else in the area will take the damage, sure, but that one target in particular is also going to have their speed reduced, or take extra damage from lightning, or whatever we may do. So far, that is really the main point of our build, and it will be for a while. The one other thing I will say about this that's actually pretty nice is because it incentivizes us to curse a target and then do a spell, and then once that target dies, curse another target and then do a spell, etc., etc. That actually gives us a lot of longevity for a caster. Instead of just being a supernova who wants to just cast a spell, cast a spell, cast a spell, we actually want to mix in cantrips with spells in this sort of rhythm in combat. That's just kind of a hidden benefit to this feature. At level 4, we are Wizard 3, and here we gain second level spells. Pick your faves again. It's going to be pretty much pick your favorite spells for most of these, but we just want to make sure that we're looking out for a wide array of damage types, or again, battery sort of spells that have a lot of damage types in one spell in particular. Or B, we want a wide array of effects that are added in addition to the damage they deal. The spell Rhyme's Binding Ice is actually a good example of this. It's a big cone effect, and when an enemy in this cone fails their save, their speed just drops to 0. Technically, it already deals cold damage, so if we hit the cursed enemy with just this spell in particular, it's not really going to do much extra. But if we change it to lightning damage, we could actually reduce their speed to 0 and blast them with a little bit of extra lightning damage equal to our charisma modifier. So just keep in mind that the effect of the spell is actually a bit more important than the damage type for us now, since with Scribe Wizard, we can sub out the damage type as much as we want. At level 5, we are Wizard 4, and here we're just going to cap our intelligence with a +2 boost, since that is our primary casting stat. Also, since we are a multi-class of 2 full casters, we do now have access to 3rd level spell slots, but only 2nd level spells. So whatever big bomb spells you decide to pick up, make sure we upcast those to full effect. At level 6, we are a Wizard 5, and here we finally get to pick up the big bomb spell that is Fireball. Feel free to pick up any other 3rd level spell as well, or even change Fireball if you really want to. Just keep in mind that we want as many damage types as possible. That way we can change our spells to different elements. For example, Fireball could become an Ice Ball, an Acid Ball, a Lightning Ball, etc. And of course, the reason I'm really pushing Fireball is because this is a spell that is just a very broken staple for casters who want to deal a lot of damage. We don't have to be the ones dealing lots of damage, but in terms of AoE effects, it's probably not going to get better than Fireball for a little while, and it'll scale really well with the rest of our upcasting that we're going to get, given that we have to bounce back and forth between Wizard and Sorcerer. At level 7, we are going to bounce back to Sorcerer, like I said last level. We want to increase Sorcerer a bit more in order to pick up some sorcery points and eventually meta magic. With Sorcerer 2, we get those sorcery points with Font of Magic. We only have 2 right now, so we can really just refresh a 1st level spell slot, but eventually we'll be able to put them to a bit better use. At level 8, we are a Sorcerer 3, and here we gain meta magic. The main meta magic features that we want are Twin Spell and Quicken Spell, though admittedly any meta magics that you can get will be very useful. With Quicken Spell, a neat combo we could do is we can curse an enemy with a cantrip with our action, and then immediately blast them with a leveled spell, instead of having to wait until the next turn to trigger the curse. And with Twin Spell, we can curse an enemy and set up hex on them and do all that sort of stuff. And then when we do go to cast a spell that hits that enemy, we can twin it, so that way it hits another enemy as well, just giving us a little bit more of an action economy boost instead of having to focus one single target all the time. At level 9, we are a Sorcerer 4, and here we gain another ASI/feat. Here we are going to take another feat, which we are taking the Shadow Touched feat, kind of the opposite of Fey Touched. This gives us access to essentially the Darkness element. Essentially, Shadow Touch lets us cast Invisibility once per long rest for free without expending a spell slot, just like our Misty Step. And then we also gain a Necromancy or Illusion spell as 1st level to pick from. We're going to count both these spells as Darkness because the Elementalist actually has a card that turns an ally of ours invisible and creates darkness, and we'll probably want to use Invisibility more for that rather than ourself. And for the additional 1st level spell that we're going to take, I'm going to say we take False Life, because False Life is just a little bit of a buff to our hit points, and we're fairly frail as the Elementalist. In Gloomhaven, and for us with 12 Constitution, we do not have a lot of hit points, so we want as much either temporary HP, damage reduction, or whatever you might find to help our durability. At level 10, we are back to Wizard for Wizard 6, and we gain the next Scribe Wizard feature. This feature is Manifest Mind. We can actually conjure a spectral mind of our awakened spellbook to actually take a physical shape on the battlefield. The main reason we want this feature is because we can cast spells as though we were in the Manifest Mind's space, which is actually pretty much the exact same feature that the Simulacrum card that the Elementalist has in Gloomhaven. This is very much a one-to-one recreation of a summon, and that's really awesome to have. It's even more awesome that it came from the Scribe Wizard subclass, which already gave us our Elementalist sort of shtick of changing between different elements to do whatever we want to do in any given moment. It's just a really good 2 birds with 1 stone situation. At level 11, it's time to check in on how our build's doing so far, especially since we have a couple options where to go with it next. So, we're pretty much doing everything that we actually want to as the Elementalist. We just don't have all the elements that we want. We're going to need to pick up an incentive for fire, and we're also going to need to pick up an incentive for light. The Elementalist usually creates light whenever they heal, so we're probably going to want some sort of healing spell, and that'll act as darkness, where the incentives are just more of like, if we cast it, that's kind of what it feels like it's not really an important feature. For fire, however, we do want an actual incentive to cast it regularly in certain situations. So we're going to have to pick that up. The trick is, it doesn't really matter too much how we go about this. For the sake of our build, I'm going to say we're going to go up to Wizard 12 and Sorcerer 8, but you could mix and match however you want because we already have all the stuff from Scribe Wizard that we want, and we already have most of the stuff from Sorcerer that we want. So at level 11, we are at a Wizard 7. Wizard 7 gets us 4th level spells. Pick whatever you want. It doesn't really matter too much. Just keep in mind we want spells with a variety of damage types or some really cool effects. Also, as an 11th level caster, we have 6th level spell slots. It's probably just going to be an upcast of Fireball, but really you can cast whatever you want with it. Level 12, we are going to be a Wizard 8, and here we are going to pick up our Fire incentive. That is the Elemental Adept feat. Elemental Adept just lets us ignore resistance when we cast a spell of the chosen damage type. We're choosing Fire. And anytime we roll dice that deal damage, we treat a 1 on a dice we roll as a 2. This isn't a huge amount of incentive, but it is actually kind of important, and here's why. Lightning, Ice, and Earth are all based around our Curse of the Sea feature, which means those are all incentives for a single target. Fire, on the other hand, is going to be our incentive for AoEs. If there are just a bunch of enemies that are grouped up that we want to just get rid of as fast as possible, or at least deal as much damage to as possible, we're going to use an actual fire damage spell. We could just leave Fireball as is, or pick your favorite other one. The reason for this is because when we use fire damage, the fact that we treat every 1 as a 2 is going to really increase our average damage as well as our minimum damage with that spell. For example, a basic Fireball, instead of doing 8d6, which is a minimum of 8 damage, it's now a minimum of 16. Literally double. That's pretty nice. This also just gets better the more dice we roll. If you're like me, you roll very poorly very often. So if we're rolling a huge handful of like 10d6, 11d6, something really big, we want as many of those dice that we do end up rolling as a 1 to actually have a little bit more value than what they do normally. The other nice thing is that because this isn't one of the D&D features that's like add your modifier to 1 roll of the damage that you roll with the spell, this actually just flat out improves the overall damage to every single target in that AoE, which means we really want to use this for whenever there are large groups of enemies that we can just blast away. The last thing that's a nice incentive is because we want that damage buff of 1s equals 2s on specifically fire damage. If any of those enemies in that AoE have resistance to fire damage, the fact that we can now just ignore it means we don't have to worry about either them resisting it or switching to another damage type. And that's really crucial as well, because now we can literally just blast them with fire, and unless they're immune, we don't care about what their stat block says. They are taking the full amount of damage, or at least as much as possible, assuming they maybe fail or pass their save. And that's really what it is to be an elementalist now, since we have fire, ice, air, and earth. At level 13, we'll jump back to Sorcerer 5. Sorcerer 5 doesn't really get us too much, again, because our charisma is fairly low. Actually, with Shadow Touch, I never mentioned this, but with Shadow Touch, we would have improved charisma by 1 to get to 15, since we didn't need to improve our intelligence with it. That means that it's an odd number, and it's still only a +2 to our modifier, so we're not really doing a lot with charisma. So as far as the spells and stuff that we get from it, pick your favorites. It doesn't really matter too much, but we do want the extra sorcery point that we get, and that's really why I'm going up to Sorcery 8, is just to have more sorcery points available. At level 14, we're going to go up to Sorcery 6, and this actually does give us the next feature from our Sea Sorcery feature. It's something that really isn't too important in terms of Gloomhaven stuff, but it's still nice to have. We gain the feature Watery Defense, and Watery Defense is alright. It essentially just gives us straight up resistance to fire damage, and then a neat get out of dodge feature where if an enemy hits us with an attack, and that attack deals piercing, slashing, or bludgeoning damage, we can use our reaction to get resistance, and then move up to 30 feet away without provoking an opportunity attack. That's very situational and not going to happen too much. But the fire resistance is actually pretty cool because, well, number one, it's the only actual damage type we resist, just flat out. But because it's fire, it actually adds to our incentive for casting fire damage. Basically, now we can danger close and drop a fireball at our feet if we find ourselves surrounded by a lot of different enemies. Hopefully, we never actually have to do that, but for what it's worth, we can if we really need to. At level 15, we're going to be a Sorcerer 7. We now have 4th level Sorcerer spells. Pick whatever you like. But for the most part, again, we're just here for the sorcery points. At level 16, we are a Sorcerer 8, and we get our second last ASI/. We've got a bit of a dilemma, because there are 3 things we kind of want to do. We still want to gain healing to be a light element incentive. We still want to, hopefully, round off our Charisma to 16, just to make it more useful whenever we do use a feature that uses our Charisma. And finally, we also kind of want to improve our health if we can, just by upping our Constitution modifier. For the sake of this build, though, I'm going to say we're focusing mostly on light first, since we're the Elementalist. And then, depending on how we get that, that'll inform what we do with our last ASI/feat. Here at Sorcerer 8, we're going to take a feat. And we're either going to take Magic Initiate or Divinely Favored. Divinely Favored we used in our Cragheart again, and that is a feat that is restricted usually to just Dragonlance only campaign settings. But if you can get access to it, and if your DM allows it, it's very good. Because as long as we are good aligned, we can take a Cleric spell that we can cast once per day for free, plus with any of our spell slots. And we could pick Healing Word as a healing spell, but then we can also choose to use Intelligence with that instead of Wisdom, which is very key, because then it actually is a whole lot of healing that we get from it. If you can't do that, Magic Initiate lets us pick a spell from the Bard spell list. And if we pick the Bard spell list, we can still pick up Healing Word, but then we use our Charisma to use for it. And technically, Magic Initiate only works once per day flat out, unless you actually have a feature that gives you spells known, because with Magic Initiate, we know the spell. It doesn't actually say we can cast it with other spell slots, but since we know it, we can get around that. And we have a lot of spells known with Sorcerer, which means that not only could we cast Healing Word once per day for free, but we could cast it again because it would be added to our Sorcerer repertoire. And that's really awesome. Our Charisma just isn't that great, so we would then want to increase our Charisma to make the healing that much more effective. There actually is one more feat we could take, which is Artificer Initiate. Artificer Initiate would give us access to Cure Wounds, because Artificers have Cure Wounds on their spell list. We wouldn't actually have to worry about the range of touch for that spell, because we have our Manifest Mind, which could go around and heal our allies for us, casting Cure Wounds through the Manifested Mind. Any of those are viable options. I'm going to say we took Artificer Initiate, but again, we don't really feel like an Artificer, so all the tinkering and stuff we get from that feat isn't too important. But the Cure Wounds and the ability to cast it through Manifest Mind, and the fact that it's a D8 instead of a D4 plus Intelligence is pretty nice, but you can pick whatever you like. That also means that since we did this, I'm probably not going to round off Charisma, and we're just going to improve our health with our last ASI/feat. Also at Sorcerer 8, we get our last sorcery point, so keep that in mind for when you're using meta magic. Level 17, we're jumping back to Wizard, and we're staying there for the rest of the build. We are now a Wizard 9, and we get 5th level spells. Pick whatever you would like here. It doesn't really matter too much what we choose. The main spell that we do eventually want is going to be Chain Lightning, but we're not getting that until a couple levels from now. One 5th level spell that actually is pretty good to pick up right now would be Summon Draconic Spirit. That's because that spell has pretty much every damage type in the entire game of D&D contained within its one spell section. Plus we could summon a dragon if we really wanted to, but at the very least, it's a very powerful battery spell for the rest of our elemental damage types. Speaking of, another incentive for the light element and for the darkness element from Gloomhaven would be the radiant necrotic damage types, which we can use. We haven't really worried about getting them so far, but we could certainly use if we really wanted to as an elementalist. 18, we are a Wizard 10, and therefore we get the next Scribe Wizard feature. And that's really not too important of a feature. It's just Master Scrivener, and that essentially says that we can make regular spell scrolls really well, so we can just dish those out to our party members. And we also can make special spell scrolls for ourselves, which are essentially 1st or 2nd level spells that we want to cast, and then they automatically cast as 1 level higher when we do read the spell scroll and use that spell. Really, all in all, this just adds up to more longevity. It doesn't really feel too much like Gloomhaven, though there are items in Gloomhaven that are spell scrolls, so you could try to mimic some of those, but I'm not going to really worry about that. At level 19, we are Wizard 11, and we just gained 6th level spells. Here I am picking up Chain Lightning because it is a spell that the Elementalist actually has, which is completely awesome. And it's also a powerful spell in D&D anyways. We can also change it so it's not just lightning damage hopping from target to target. It could be cold, fire, pretty much whatever we want. You don't have to pick it up if you don't want to, and again, pick up any other spell that you would like to pick up as long as they have either a cool effect, lots of damage types, or you just really like the spell. Finally, at level 20, we are a Wizard 12, and that's going to give us our last ASI/feat. Here, all we're doing is improving our Constitution to 14 to give us a fair bit more health. We're still very weak, and so we should definitely never be at the front line of combat, but if we are, oh well. Okay, with all that said, let's summarize the build. We are definitely an Elementalist. We can, even though it's not optimal, choose to cast different element types based on what we want to do. We have an incentive for cold. It's single target, but if we have a target that we don't want to get away, we cast cold damage on them after cursing them. If we have a target we just want to kill a little bit faster, we curse them, then we deal lightning damage to them. If we have a target we want to control, we use force movement and change the spell to some sort of earth-themed damage just to make us feel like an Elementalist. Finally, if we want to just light up a room and kill as many enemies as possible, fire is the way to go. We have some healing, which is sort of our light incentive. We have some invisibility and some shield with false life, which is our darkness incentive. We also have our simulacrum, aka our manifested mind, which gives us a little bit more area of control, reach, range, whatever you want to call it, more possibilities to use our spells from different areas, so that way we can be safer while manifested mind is up, actually in combat, casting spells for us. Also, I didn't mention it, but theme it as though it actually is a simulacrum, and the manifest mind is literally just a doppelganger of you. And other than that, we've accomplished pretty much all we've set out to accomplish. If you didn't take Unearthed Arcana, then obviously that'll change the build a little bit, but the Storm Sorcerer that I had mentioned does have enough incentive for like lightning and thunder damage that it would at least feel like we get bonuses to our air element. However, cold would then be an incentive we'd have to worry about. And the last thing to mention is Hex from character creation. As always, we really haven't picked any spells that use concentration, unless you did, or you've actually summoned like your Draconic Spirit or something. And because of that, we can always just have Hex on the enemies that we want to curse and just add a little bit more damage to them. That's a pretty nice feature in and of itself, and is an interesting playstyle, I would think, for a full-leveled caster. Either way, let me know what you thought about the build, or how you would change it to get more to the theme of the Elementalist from Gloomhaven, or even how you would just do an element generalist in D&D instead of someone who specializes into like fire. How would you get someone who specializes into fire, earth, air, and ice or water? Thank you so much for joining me on the journey, and I hope to see you in the next one.